And there we go. And good evening, everyone. I am so glad that we made it this far to get to this class. Baruch Hashem. Hi, Diana. Nice to see you. And we are going to be finishing off this series that we have been discussing for the last 4 weeks. This is the 5th class in our series of creating sacred spaces. And as always, I just want to point out that this class is not a continuation of any class. So if you're missing any of the previous classes, you'll still be able to follow along. But as you know, any of the previous classes, you can always look back at the recordings. They're all posted on the group chat. And we are focusing on the topic that we've been discussing throughout this entire series of how to take a house and turn it into a space of spirituality. In essence, going through every room in the house and understanding the beauty, the mitzvahs that are connected with that space, understanding the spiritual energy that we could bring to that space, and how we can elevate the environment that we live in and that our families live in and that our friends share when they visit us in our homes, and elevate our homes. So before we get to the main topic that we're going to be discussing, I just wanted to bring up something small that I feel like is really worth bringing into this conversation, even though we're not going to have a whole class on it, which is, if any of you have ever been in my house or any rabbi's house or any house that you walk in and you're like, wow, there are a lot of, finish that sentence for me, books. There are a lot of books. I mean, if you come into my house, we have a lot of books. We have, just in our living room area and dining room area, we have 8 or 9 full bookshelves that are full, and we still have more in the kids' bedrooms, and we still have an overflow of books. And I get this question very often. Well, there's really 2 questions that come along with this, and that is, why so many? And have you actually read any of them? So the second question I defer to my husband, because yes, he does learn and study from a lot of the books that we have. But even if they're not books that we learn from and study from on a regular basis, there is a beautiful Jewish concept of having Jewish books of Torah, Sfarim, in a Jewish home, and bringing the beauty of Torah study into the very fabric of the house, just by having them on the bookshelves in the home. Now, if you have them on the bookshelf, you're much more likely to pick up the book and read it, study from it, learn from it. But even if you're not, there's a beautiful concept of having Jewish books in a home. And in fact, one of the 10 major mitzvah campaigns that the Rebbe started, the Lubavitcher Rebbe started, was Bayit Malei Sfarim, that a house should be full of Sfarim, of holy books. And definitely this house qualifies. I see a beautiful bookshelf full of Jewish books and books with Torah concepts. But I encourage everyone, if you have the opportunity to either purchase books, or if you have books that are sitting in boxes, put them on a bookshelf, put them on display. And part of what we were discussing, how the walls of our homes speak, and the walls of our homes exude the energy and the vibe that we want to have in our home. And we spoke about that with the mezuzah that we have attached to the door, and the tzedakah box that we have on the wall. And of course, everyone has their own aesthetic style, but our the art on our walls should reflect our values, and should reflect holiness and beauty and real connection to what we hold dear to us. And also that the walls of our home should be graced with Jewish books. So I just want to put that out there, because it would be remiss to have a whole discussion about a Jewish home, and I'll bring up all of the many books that we should have in a Jewish home. But tonight we're actually going to discuss another room in the house. Now, for some of you, if you're lucky enough, it's kind of my dream to have your own specific room for this. For others, it might just be a little corner or in the garage or somewhere else. It's, I would say, what's used most often, but enjoyed least of all. Okay, kids playroom. Yeah, well, cleaning the playroom, that I agree with. But you use it, you spend more time in there than you wish you had to. And there we go, the laundry room. We spend a lot of time with our laundry. At least, I don't know, I do. I feel like the smaller my kids are, the more dirty laundry they produce. But we have a lot of clothing. And tonight we're actually going to be discussing clothing, because whether we think of it connected with the laundry room, the closets in our room, I mean, clothing takes up a big portion of our home. People have created entire careers just out of organizing closets. And that's because closets are full, especially, let's be real, a woman's closet, it's really full. And tonight we're going to be discussing clothing. And in fact, it actually ties into the Torah portions that we are discussing this week, next week. Over the next several weeks, the Torah portions are discussing the building, the construction of the Mishkan, the temporary temple that was built in the desert when the Jews were traveling out of, after they left Egypt, after they received the Torah. And in the Torah portions that we're discussing, part of what we learn about in extreme detail is the construction of the vessels in the temple, the construction of the structure of the temple itself, and the clothing that was worn by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and by the Kohanim, by the priests, when they were doing their service in the temple. And the Torah discusses the clothing of the priests as if it were a blueprint for a fashion designer. Literally, the details, describing the fabrics, describing the patterns. Hello, come in, there's a chair waiting right here for you. Describing every detail of how it was constructed, how it was woven. Catch you up quickly, we're talking about your favorite room in the house, the laundry room. We're talking about clothing. So the clothing is described in so much detail, which is strange if you think about it, because who cares? I mean, like, what's the big deal about the clothing that was worn in the temple? But the truth is that the fact that so much attention to detail was given, and that the clothing had to be sewn and worn in exactly the correct manner in order for the priests to be able to do their service, tells us a huge amount about the significance of clothing that we wear. In fact, the Kohen was not allowed to perform his service in the temple if he wasn't dressed properly. Part of getting ready to do the service in the temple was being dressed appropriately. And there were very specific articles of clothing, 4 articles of clothing that the general priests wore, the Kohanim wore. There was the pants, the mechnasayim, there was the tunic shirt, there was the belt, and there was a specific hat. And that was what the Kohen wore when he performed his service in the temple. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had 8 articles of clothing. Those 4 articles of clothing, the pants, the tunic, the belt, and the hat, although the hat of the Kohen Gadol was a different shape than the one of the regular Kohen. In addition to that, he had 4 additional clothes. He had the long robe, the beautiful robe that had the bells and the pomegranates hanging from the bottom. There was the breastplate, there was the headpiece that was worn across his forehead, and there was an apron that was worn attaching the breastplate. Now that's very specific. And each of these articles of clothing have significance. And not only that, but the Torah actually tells us, and our commentaries explain, that each of these articles of clothing were meant to atone for a different sin. Interestingly enough, each article of clothing represented something and atoned for a different sin. For example, the breastplate, which was beautiful, made up of the jewels representing the 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes, each one a different color. And that was where it was called the Choshen Mishpat, which was the representing judgment, and it atoned for lack of judgment or people who behaved in a way that was against the judgment or lack of justice. There were different other sins that each one atoned by a different piece of clothing. So many details, so much meaning in what we wear. I mean, really? And more importantly, why is it so important? And how does that affect us? So nowadays, we don't have to wear specific articles of clothing for prayer, especially as women. Although there are articles of clothing that are connected to prayer, like the talit and things like that. But how does the importance and the beauty of the lessons that we learn from the clothing spoken about in the Torah apply to us as women when we're folding the socks and hanging up the dresses and, sliding the t-shirts onto the shelves, trying to keep it as organized as possible, or at least as clean as possible. And how can we bring the beauty of it into our own homes as well? So that the clothing that we have in our laundry rooms, going from the washer to the dryer, however long that takes, by the way, that could be right away or 7 to 10 business days, however long it takes you to get your laundry from the washer to the dryer, and certainly till it gets folded, if it ever does. No judgments here from anyone. However long it takes, right? The clothing that we have hanging in our closet, whether it's on the closet or if you have a designated chair or couch in your room that's meant for piling the clothing. I see you, I got you. I have a couch in my room. We call it the extra laundry because that's where, you all know what I mean, right? We have clothes everywhere. How do we bring meaning and sacredness to the clothing in our home? So when the Torah describes the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, the Torah uses two beautiful words, kavod v'tiferet, which means honor and glory. And the Torah says that wearing the clothing that was the uniform of the priest brought him honor and glory as a person. In fact, he was not considered ready for his kahuna, for his priestly service, until he was adorned with the honor and glory befitting the job that he was doing. Which begs the question, does clothing make man? Does what we wear have an impact on who we are? How much does our external clothing, our garments, how much does that affect our essence? And that's a question that's been asked and been discussed, and certainly something that is really at the forefront of the fashion influencers of the world. And whatever we're wearing now, no matter how fashion forward or basic or whatever it is, whether it's the newest style or if it's been sitting in your closet for 20 years, someone thought up this design, someone thought of this fashion. And when thinking about the clothing that was made, the question that was really being asked is, what does that say about this person, right? When you wear an article of clothing, what does it say about you? And the Torah perspective of clothing is that we are, as human beings, as spiritual beings, we are at our core a soul that is within a body. But the way that we dress and cover our bodies should be a reflection of our soul. That when we get dressed in the morning, we should be letting our soul speak, not our body speak. And when you see someone's clothing, it should be an expression of their essence, not of their bodies. And the Torah tells us with the words kavod v'tiferet, that our clothing should bring us honor and glory. Now, when else do we discuss clothing in Torah and Judaism? We have the clothing that is worn on Shabbat. In fact, it is a very important part of the celebration of Shabbat to wear extra beautiful, special clothing for Shabbat. Now, for everyone, that's going to look like something different, but there should be clothing in your closet that you don't wear every day because you keep them for special occasions, you keep them for Shabbat. In fact, it's discussed in the Talmud that even is observing Shabbat without anyone else around them, or with only people who do not observe Shabbat, if they're the only Jew in their entire environment, they should still dress in Shabbat clothing. Because the clothing that you wear for Shabbat is not for the synagogue fashion show, contrary to popular belief. It's not because you're going to synagogue and everyone has to see what you just picked up. It's for you. And it's so that you feel elevated and you feel like this is a holy day, this is a special day. Even if you're in your own home and you're not going to leave your home the entire Shabbat, you should put on something, make it as comfortable as you want, but something special that you feel this is for Shabbat. I know for myself, and there are, many stages of leaving the house on Shabbat. For those of you who usually see me on Shabbat, these days I can't be walking to shul, so I'm home for all of Shabbat. I still put on a full face of makeup before Shabbat. And it's not for anybody else in my house. Believe me, nobody else cares. It's for me. It's really only for me because that's my way of getting dressed for Shabbat. And I have my Shabbat lipsticks and I put them on because even if I'm not going out anywhere, that feels Shabbostic. It feels that Shabbat energy. So clothing is meant to beautify oneself and bring that feeling as well. The same thing is with clothing, the other times that we discuss clothing, especially, coming up now, Purim, we discussed the idea of, wearing costumes on Purim. Why are we wearing costumes on Purim? Now, that's not a law. It's a custom. You're welcome to, you don't have to, but it gets us into the spirit. It's not for everybody else. It's not for the masquerade or the costume contest or whatever it is. It's for us to feel that elevation. So on a regular day, when we are getting dressed and we are taking care of our clothing for ourselves, for our family, we want to make sure that the clothing that we have and the clothing that we wear represents our values. Now, you see that a lot when you look at different styles. Now, styles, come and go. Trends are constantly changing, and there's nothing wrong per se with being in fashion, as long as it fits your values. But we know, and if anyone has I really should not be talking about fashion. Like, I really am not like the fashion expert you should ever talk to. But it's very clear if you ever go onto any clothing website or if you go to any mall, that what is in style and what's considered beautiful by society is always changing. What's considered cool and fashionable one year is so outdated the next year. It's like old news, which realistically makes no sense. Like, if it was pretty last year, it's pretty this year. Like, I went shopping for shoes for my kids, and the saleswoman was telling me, in the back I have last year's selection, and it's much cheaper, whatever. And I said, well, are they used shoes? She's like, no, they're brand new. They're just last year's selection. I'm like, well, if they were cute last year, they're cute this year for me too. Like, they were nice shoes last year, they're nice shoes this year. Please let me see, right? So society's standard of beauty when it comes to clothing and externals is constantly changing. But the Torah value of what's beautiful has never changed. And when you're looking for truth, the first step to finding what's true is something that never changes. Because a truth, if you're really sticking to the truth, no matter how many times you say it, it's going to sound the same, because the truth is the truth. A made-up story, every time you say it, it's going to sound different. Or every time you hear it, if you keep hearing the story with different details, you know that part of it isn't true, because truth doesn't change and falsity is constantly changing. So if we're looking to see what is the standard of clothing that we should live by, what is the truth of what's important to live by when it comes to the standard of clothing? Well, society is always changing and Torah values are always the same. So which one is truth? Obviously, it's clear that Torah values are the truth of what beauty actually really is. Now, it doesn't have to look the same in every generation. I mean, I always think how fascinating it would be just to look at the closet of our matriarchs and look at the closet of the Jewish women in Spain and look at the closet of Queen Esther. Oh, I would love a tour of her closet, right? Like, just to see, never mind the historical aspect of, seeing different styles of clothing, but also to see what they considered beautiful now would be like, nobody would ever wear that, although maybe by now it's already considered stylish again. You know how things come and go, but it doesn't have to look the same. But you know what would be the same? The standards of modesty, the standard of wearing clothing that represent who we are inside, rather than just celebrating the shape of our bodies. That is something that I'm sure would be a consistent pattern with every generation. And if it isn't, then we have a problem. Because clothing are meant to be lekavod v'letiferet, for the honor and glory of the person. In fact, the Torah tells us that there were 3 things that the Jewish people didn't do when they were living in Egypt. And it was part of that merit that they were redeemed from Egypt. 3 things that they never changed. In many areas, they may have become, absorbing the Egyptian culture or the Egyptian way of life because they were slaves to the Egyptians, but there were 3 things that they never changed. They never changed their language, which means they never lost the holy tongue. They didn't change their names. They kept their Jewish identities, and they never changed their clothing. They always dressed as Jews. Why didn't they start dressing like Egyptians? Because they didn't want to become Egyptians. In fact, we see this as well in the story of Yosef. When Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef was the 11th son of Yaakov, of Jacob, and he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Story for another day if you don't know that story. And he ended up as a servant in the home of one of Paro's advisors, one of Paro's ministers, Potiphar. And the Torah tells us that Potiphar's wife was attracted to him and she wanted him. And he had to use extreme self-control to not succumb to the temptation. And the Torah describes the confrontation that they had, which was that one day when they were home alone, she grabbed him, and she grabbed him by his clothing. And he needed to make a quick getaway. So he ran off, leaving her holding the clothing, and ran off to avoid sitting with her. And she was extremely upset that he refused her. So she, being the Egyptian woman advisor of Paro's palace, you can imagine her value system, she accused him of assault, and he ended up in prison. Sounds like a good story, right? What does the commentary tell us about the fact that she took his clothing? Our sages tell us, and Hasidic thought explains and discusses this in great depth, something so beautiful. She knew that he held his values. She wasn't a dumb woman. And she knew that he would never succumb to the temptation because his values were so strong. But she thought that if she could get him to dress like an Egyptian, then eventually he would not be able to resist. His clothing. She wanted him to dress like an Egyptian, because if he would dress like an Egyptian, then he would start thinking like an Egyptian. And if he would start thinking like an Egyptian, then he would start acting like an Egyptian. Even she recognized that clothing helps us remember who we are. So when we dress in a manner that is befitting the honor and glory of our soul, that is befitting the value that we have inside as Jewish women, and the impressive and incredible value that the Torah places on each one of us, and the value of the fact that we have a part of God literally inside each one of us, our divine soul deserves to be wearing clothing that represent our soul, clothing that represent our values. And when we dress in that manner, it's not only for the outside world to know this is a Jewish woman. It's not really for everyone else, which is why, although many people equate the beauty of the mitzvah of modesty as, women have to be modest for the sake of the men, it has nothing to do with the men. It has nothing to do with the men. It has to do with a woman wearing the clothing to remind each one of us who we are. And yes, clothing makes the man. Who we are doesn't change based on what we're wearing. Our clothing don't define our essence, but our clothing allows our essence to speak. The voice of who we are should be heard. If you think about it, something so basic. Take a police officer. A police officer who is in uniform and a police officer who's off duty. Same person, and he doesn't change. He's always a police officer, whether he's wearing his uniform or not. But he will behave differently when he's in uniform because his clothing represents who he is. He has to behave a certain way because people look at him and see why he's a police officer. But it's not just for the other people, it's also for himself or any other person in uniform. There's a beautiful story that is told that there was one of the great followers of the Chabad Rebbe's was imprisoned for the grave crime of spreading Judaism in communist Russia. And he was in prison with many other, government enemies. And he got to know a lot of his fellow prisoners who were either, enemies of the state or in prison for whatever reason. And most of the time, there wasn't much to do in the prison. So most of the time, the prisoners would, wake up really late because there was no reason to wake up early in the morning. But this chassid, this holy Jew, woke up early every morning to pray. And he noticed that there was one other prisoner who also woke up every morning. And this prison, I guess, was a lower security prison, so they each were allowed to have a little bit of their own belongings. And this chassid was able to have his talit, his tefillin, his prayer book. He had his, important things. And the other prisoner that he would see every morning, he also had his important things. What did this other prisoner have? He had a uniform from the army with him. And every morning, this chassid would wake up to say his prayers, and he would see that this individual had his own morning ritual. What would he do? He would wake up every morning. He would put on his uniform. And he had actually been a general. So he had a very decorated uniform. He would put on his uniform and he would walk back and forth, marching, saluting, doing his army training, and then he would take it off and he would continue with his day. And this chassid was always wondering, why does he do this every day? So finally he asked him one day, he said, tell me, you're in prison. You're never going to be a general again. Whatever army he was a general of, the country was not happy with him because, he was sitting in prison. So it didn't look like he was going to be reinstated to his job anytime soon, that he needed to keep up with his training. So tell me, why do you put on your uniform every day and salute and march and do whatever you're doing? Why? And this man looked at him and he said, every day I put on my uniform to remind myself that they may think I'm a prisoner, but really, I'm a general. He didn't want to lose his sense of self. He didn't want to lose his confidence in himself. And he couldn't remember that he was the general even without the clothing. But putting on the clothing made him feel like the general that he was. Because that was the expression of who he was at his essence. And the chassid realized that what this general was doing was not so different than what he did every morning, putting on his talit and his tefillin and wearing his kippah and praying. That was the chassid's expression of who he truly was. So really, when we look in the mirror and we think, well, who am I as a Jewish woman? The next question we can ask ourselves is, do my clothing, does my appearance reflect who I am? And we're not going to get into the laws of modesty and the halachot, and everyone has their own level of modesty that they keep to. And I encourage everyone to strengthen their level of modesty in whatever form that takes. But when we dress in a way that we are beautifully covering our bodies, we are sending the message that my body is not what I want speaking. It's my soul that I want the voice to be heard. It's my values, it's my personality, it's my talent, it's who I am on the inside that I want to shine, that I want to give a voice to. And it's interesting because, if you would walk into a room of many different women, all keeping the same standard of modesty. Now, I'm not talking about a high school classroom, because somehow in a high school classroom, everyone thinks the same things are cool and dresses exactly the same way. But as mature women, you'll find so many different styles of clothing. And each one is beautiful because it represents the person wearing the clothing. And it's so important that what we wear says something about who we are, not what we are, but who we are, what we value, what we aspire to be, what we live for, what's important to us, what we're passionate about. That is what our clothing says. And when we recognize the value that our clothing has in helping us express ourselves, well, laundry becomes easier because we appreciate our clothing for what it does for us. And we appreciate our clothing for what it does for our loved ones if we're hanging up their clothing or folding endless amounts of tiny socks that never seem to find the match for. I mean, when we recognize that the clothing is really representing who we are inside, it is something so powerful. On the topic of clothing, Tanya describes, and we've mentioned this in the past, but it's such a beautiful idea to really understand. Tanya, the foremost book of Chabad Hasidic ideology, discusses the garments of the soul. That each one of our divine souls has garments, has clothing. They're called the levushe haneshama, the levushim, the clothing of our soul. Each one of us have the identical core of our soul, because our soul all comes from the same source. It comes from God, and it's identical at its core, which is what unites each one of us, despite all of our differences. But we each have unique garments to our soul. And what's beautiful is that just like you can choose what to wear, and nobody's forcing you to wear certain things, besides for if you're in school and you have a uniform, okay, maybe. But even so, you can always personalize it a little bit. We choose the clothing that we wear. Clothing is not permanent. We can take it off, put it on, change it. We can even wear somebody else's clothing. There's so much flexibility when it comes to clothing. Our soul's clothing also has similar values. What is the clothing of the soul? Our thoughts, our speech, and our actions. And those are all things that we can control. We can control what we think about, or rather what we dwell on. We can't always control the thoughts that pop into our head, but we can control how much brain space we allow them to take up. And by the way, when I say we can control it, doesn't mean it's easy. It takes work, but it's possible. But our thoughts are within our control, and we can switch out our thoughts for other thoughts. We can choose what we want to think about. In fact, we can even adopt other people's thoughts, whether you agree with them or not. But if you're reading a book that somebody else wrote, in your mind, you have thoughts that are somebody else's thoughts that are now occupying your space. The same is with our speech. We choose the words that come out of our mouths. Sometimes it requires an incredible amount of self-control to not say something that we want to say, or to say something that we wish we didn't have to say, right? Doesn't make it easy, but it's definitely within our control. We can also share our speech. We can repeat other people's words. There's a lot of flexibility with the words that we say. And our actions. We choose our actions. And these three things are the clothing of our soul. And the thoughts that we think about, and the words that we say, and the actions and the deeds that we do represent our soul. And Hasidic teaching tells us that not only are they a reflection of our soul, but they actually affect our soul as well. The same way we were discussing how clothing affects us as well, because the way that we dress affects the way that we perceive ourselves. So it goes both ways. Our clothing should reflect who we are, and our clothing also affects who we are. The same is with our thought, speech, and action. Our thoughts, our speech, and our action are a reflection of who we are. But it also has the ability to change who we are. How do we work on ourselves? God made us, but He didn't make us perfect. So we all have flaws. You don't have to name them, you don't have to list them, but we all have flaws. We can choose to say, well, this is the way God made me, so I'm perfect the way I am. You are perfect the way you are at your core. But we all have things that we need to work on to make ourselves better. That's what makes us a human, growing, evolving person. How do we grow? By changing out the clothing, by changing our thoughts, by altering our speech, and by behaving differently. That has the power to affect who we are. And why are we discussing this when we are discussing the Jewish home? Not just because we happen to have a lot of clothing in our homes and we do a lot of laundry in our homes. I bless everyone with cleaning help to take care of their laundry for them. But the way that we behave and the way that we speak and the way that we think even has so much power that it affects not only ourselves, but it affects our home. It affects our environment. And when we want to create a change in the mood in our home, in the feeling, in the energy of our homes, it all starts with ourselves. You can try to change the people around you. Probably won't work. Whether it's a family member, a coworker, anyone that you are in close proximity to. You can't really change other people. But the best way to change an environment is to change yourself, to change your mindset, change your manner of speaking, behave differently, and watch the ripple effect happen around you. And it works every time. There are some things you can't change, but your environment will change if you change the clothing of your soul. Just like, and I found this most fascinating during the, thank God it's behind us, the COVID period, when many people were celebrating important milestones or simchas or family occasions without all of the normal celebratory aspects. There were people who were celebrating their weddings in backyards, bar mitzvahs in their homes without communities, without people around them. And how were they able to make that feel like a simcha? I was watching a video, I remember I couldn't believe that it was happening. And none of us could have predicted how long it would actually be happening for. There was a young couple that got married in the backyard of the bride's home because it was during the first few weeks of lockdown. They weren't changing the date of their wedding. And if you picture the dancing at a wedding, and at a Jewish wedding, an observant Jewish wedding, you have the women's side of the dancing and the men's side of the dancing. And it's beautiful. And it's typical, in a wedding hall or a wedding venue, and it's beautiful and everyone's dressed up, and the background reflects the celebration of that day. And I was watching this video, and the bride is beautifully dressed. The family, the mother, the sisters, they're all dressed in gowns, and their hair is done beautifully, and their makeup is done, and they look stunning and gorgeous, and they're dancing in the kitchen. And the men are dancing, dressed in their finest, and the chatan, the groom, is on the shoulders of his father or his father-in-law or whoever he was, the whole setting, but in the living room. It almost looked wrong until I realized that this is how right it is. How were they able to make it feel like a wedding? Because they dressed like they were at a wedding. Same scenario, but with pajamas or with, whatever. If it's not going to be a real wedding in a real venue, what do we need the makeup and the hair for? Or what do we need the wedding dresses for? It wouldn't have felt like that. But the clothing, the whole appearance that they had exuded the joy that they were feeling. And thank God we don't have to have weddings in backyards, although for some people it's beautiful and it's great, and it definitely cut the budget for a lot of people for weddings after that. But the clothing is what really sets the tone for the environment that you want to create. And they managed to turn, and they and many, many others who were celebrating, or in whatever time period people are celebrating, the clothing that they were wearing, the appearance that they gave, managed to turn a kitchen floor into a dance floor. They changed the whole environment simply by changing their appearance. You know, it's interesting because I heard there was this woman who she was getting dressed to go to her exams, her final exams to get her master's, and she was getting dressed for her day in college, and she wasn't the type that would always get dressed like super professional for when she was in school, whatever she was wearing, and she's getting dressed and she's wearing like this super smart outfit and whatever suit and very tailored, and her husband looks at her and is like, you have a date with a professor? Like, why are you dressed like this? She said, I'm dressing for the job I want to get when I pass this exam. I'm putting myself in the mindset that I have to pass my exams. I have to get my master's because this is how I'm going to look when I'm in this profession that I'm in. She was dressing for the part she wanted to get. In fact, there's a book, I think it's called How to Get Rich or something like that. And one of the tips they give on how to get rich is to wear very expensive clothing. When you wear very expensive clothing, you start feeling like a very rich person, and you're going to start mingling around rich people because you look like you're wearing very expensive clothing, and it'll put you in the right circumstances to create opportunities for wealth. Now, whether it works or it doesn't work, I don't know. I'm not spending $1,000 on a pair of shoes just so I could get rich. That's not my plan. And I'm sure that many people have found other ways to get rich without it. What's the idea? That when you dress a certain way, it makes you feel a certain way. When you feel a certain way, you think, speak, and act a certain way as well. So let's make sure that the way that we are dressing our souls with our thought, speech, and action is a reflection of our essence. And the way we are dressing our bodies is a reflection of our souls. That when we look in the mirror, we see the high priest ready to do his service. We see kavod v'tiferet. We see honor and glory. So on that note, I want to wish all of us that the clothing in our homes and every other part of our home that we have discussed, whether it was a topic that we discovered in this series or a topic that we'll explore another time, that every part of our home should be a place of honor and glory, and that we should always be able to bring out the best part of ourselves, the best part of our loved ones, and that truly our home should be a space that feels sacred to us and that we are proud to bring God into, because ultimately that's our goal in this world. Our goal in this world, the reason why God created us and put us in this world, is to create a dira b'tachtonim, a home in the lower world, a home for God. God wants to feel at home. So I bless each one of us that we should feel at home and comfortable and safe and loved and warm and connected in our own homes, and that we should create a home where God feels at home as well. So l'chaim to that and to all of our sacred spaces. If anyone has any questions about this topic or any others, feel free to ask. And if anyone wants to share anything, please do.